Good day. Today is Thursday, 5th December 2024, and just before I started making this program, news began to come in from Syria, which confirmed that the key city of Hama has fallen to the jihadi Islamist fighters fighting the government of President Assad. Now, just yesterday, there were reports in the media, in the Syrian media and in the Iranian media about successful counterattacks by the Syrian army driving the jihadis north from Hama. There were reports that the Syrian military had successfully pushed them back 20 kilometers. There was further reports about the Syrian army breaking through and breaking the siege of a military college close to Aleppo itself. And then just a few hours later, we got confirmation from the Syrian military itself that they had pulled out of Hama, and photographs started to appear and are circulating even as I'm making this program, showing jihadi fighters moving around Hama entirely unmolested, with no sign of any significant resistance and no sign of any significant fighting. It seems that exactly as happened in the fighting for Aleppo, despite all the claims about defense lines being established by the Syrian military north of Hama, it seems that despite those claims, despite all of the claims about successful counterattacks and offensives, when the jihadi fighters made a serious attempt to capture Hama, resistance again simply melted away. Now, all of this has happened even as the Russians have been talking with the Turks. Lavrov has been in contact with the Turkish Foreign Minister Fidan, and attempts have been made to organize a meeting of the Astana group of foreign ministers, that's to say the foreign ministers of Iran, Turkey and Russia, which is supposed to be taking place in Doha, in Qatar, apparently on Saturday. The Russians must be asking themselves, even as they work to try to get this conference organized, whether there's any point in doing so, whether before long the entire government of Syria, the entire military and governmental apparatus in Syria, it might soon simply fall apart. Now, it is difficult to convey the sense of frustration and anger that exists in Russia about these events. I should say that no attempt seems to have been made to organize a proper, sustained defense of Hama, just as no attempt seems to have been made to organize a proper and sustained defense of Aleppo. Nor does there appear to have been any attempt made to evacuate the civilian population of either of these two cities before fighting began. And to a Russian mind, to the Russian military, to the political leadership, to large sections of the Russian population, this is entirely incomprehensible. Obviously, the Russians are fighting at the present time a prolonged war in Ukraine. There's been bitter fighting for control of villages, let alone towns. When towns are fought for, they are fought for over weeks and months. The Russians have to capture them after bitter fighting against fierce resistance by Ukrainian defenders. I've often spoken in many programs about the fact that I find the insistence of the Ukrainian High Command in holding on to undefendable terrain, its willingness to sacrifice the lives of its soldiers to hold on to places that it is unable to defend for long, or where it makes no sense to go on defending for very long. Completely incomprehensible. But nonetheless, the fact remains that when Ukrainian soldiers are given orders to defend some location, they carry them out. When Russian soldiers are given orders to capture a location, they also carry them out. The Russians themselves have engaged in many defensive battles over the course of the war, and they've always resisted stiffly. So have the militias of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, who held the Ukrainians back for 7+ years before the special military operation was begun. The idea that towns, whole cities of over 1 million people, as is the case in Hama and Aleppo, can be abandoned without any significant attempt at resistance, to a Russian mind, is beyond understanding and incomprehensible, and is going to be seen as cowardly. And however people may feel about Syria, President Assad, his government, and all of the rest, this is inevitably going to strengthen the discussion that is already taking place in Russia, on the internet, on the keyboards, in the bars and cafes, in all sorts of places, about whether, if the Syrians are not prepared to fight for Syria, it makes any sense for the Russians to do it for them. Now, saying all of this, that does, of course, beg the question of why this collapse has happened so quickly. After all, between 2011 and 2019, the Syrian army proved capable of defending places with extreme courage and tenacity. It did this in Hama, it did this in Aleppo, which never fell to the jihadi Islamist fighters. It did this in Deir ez-Zor, in the eastern desert, where a Syrian force completely cut off from the rest of the Syrian army, held out for months, kept supplied solely by air, and they were able to resist successfully for years until they were eventually relieved by the remainder of the Syrian army. Something clearly has happened in Syria since 2019, when the main fighting ended, which has led to an institutional rot, a decomposition of what had previously been an extremely tough and purposeful force. Now, yesterday, I had a lengthy discussion about the situation in Syria with someone I am very, very well acquainted with indeed. Now, can I say, of course, that this was yesterday? This was before news came through this morning of the fall of Hama. And I know that this person has numerous contacts with people from Syria, and I asked him why he thought the situation in Syria had deteriorated to the extent that it had, why military resistance by the army in Syria has proved so ineffectual. And this person told me that since the end of the war, since the end of the fighting in 2019, for whatever reason, and he was not prepared to speculate or discuss the reason, perhaps demoralization caused by the pandemic played a part, perhaps the Caesar sanctions played another part, though in the latter case that would rather surprise me. Fierce sanctions tend to solidify a society and a government. We can see that in Venezuela, for example, rather than cause fragmentation within it. But anyway, for whatever reason, since 2019, he told me that he'd heard and been informed by all sorts of people from Syria, that corruption in Syria has simply got completely out of control, that it is no longer endemic in society, that it has become the organizing principle within Syrian society, that since the end of the war, the Syrian authorities, the Syrian military officers have traded in the victory that was achieved, have seen it as an opportunity to enrich themselves, and that this has been happening at a staggering and uncontrolled extent. This person also expressed the view that President Assad himself was not involved personally or directly in this corruption, but that he had lost control of it because the regime that he heads is far greater than himself, and that acting to bring this corruption under control was in effect politically and administratively impossible. Well, saying that corruption is a problem in Syria in some ways begs the question. It does beg why corruption would have got out of hand to the extent that it did. But it does seem to me that at least in proximate terms, it does explain some of what has happened. The soldiers no longer want to fight for a government and a military leadership they see as exploitative and corrupt. And this is a point made to me by my acquaintance yesterday, the Syrian officers who command these soldiers are eminently bribable and have probably been bribed en masse by the backers of the jihadi fighters, Turkey, Israel, the United States, whoever it is, basically to make sure that there is no resistance when the jihadis come and advance on places like Hama and places like that. The result is that huge areas now of northwestern Syria, including Aleppo and Hama, are now under jihadi control. There is clearly been no true stabilization. I'm not sure whether a stabilization in this situation is even possible. We've had these reports that Shia militia units are moving into Syria, but one wonders whether they will arrive in time. Russian forces have also been arriving in Syria. These are tough Wagner fighters, very different in outlook from the corrupted soldiers of the Syrian army. One wonders, however, whether they too will arrive in time. Yesterday, the Iranian government was talking about sending Iranian troops to Syria. Perhaps they too will go, but again, it will take weeks before they arrive in any number. And the Syrian army itself, it seems to me, has demonstrated over the last few weeks, since the 27th of November, 2 weeks in fact, that it is incapable of putting up unorganized resistance against the jihadi fighters. And as I said, if this continues, then it's difficult to see why this should stop in any place, and perhaps before long, the jihadis will be occupying Damascus itself. Now, I have to make a few qualifications here. For the moment, the Iranian and Syrian governments, the Iranian and Russian governments, are continuing to back the government of President Assad. Other Middle Eastern governments have said the same. The Egyptian government, for example, has also publicly spoken of its continued support for President Assad's government. And if somehow the situation can be preserved from total collapse over the next 2 weeks or so, then possibly the arrival of Russian Wagner troops and Iranian troops and Shia militia troops from Iraq and Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon will be enough to turn the tide and to make a difference. There has been very little fighting in Syria over the last 2 weeks. I've seen a report that the total number of people who have been killed in the fighting up to now, since the 27th of November, civilian and military, amounts to around 800. That doesn't include people who may have died in bombing, in the Russian and Syrian Air Force bombing, just to say. But in actual fighting, the number of people who have died, and by the way that figure of 800 appears to include civilians, doesn't seem to be very high. That suggests that the jihadi fighters so far have not met any sustained organized resistance, and one wonders how they will respond if and when they do. They've also, until now, had some success using FPV drones. It is universally accepted that they've received training and some support from the Ukrainians in doing this, and they have a certain number of drones that have been supplied to them by the Ukrainians. But if they do come up against the Russians, then the Russians, of course, are far more experienced than in using FPV drones than probably any military anywhere on planet Earth. And the Russians, of course, also have the technology to jam the FPV drones that the jihadi fighters have been using and which they probably have increasingly relied upon. So, as I said, if there is a stabilization, there's talk now that the Syrians are going to try to hold back the jihadis in the town of Homs, further south. Whether that will happen, as I said, remains to be seen. But anyway, if there is a stabilization, then the jihadis will be up against forces of a completely different level to the ones that they've encountered before. And as I have discussed in previous videos, if we specifically talk about the Russians, today the Russians are vastly more powerful than they were back in 2015, and they will probably find the fighting in Syria a great deal easier than the fighting in Ukraine, even if one allows for the probability that the jihadi fighters they will be up against are more determined and more tenacious than the Syrian soldiers are. So at that point, it could very well be that the whole situation will reverse again, and all of these places, Hama, Aleppo, all of the others will fall back under government control very, very quickly. But even if that does happen, Assad's reputation, the reputation of the Syrian government and of the Syrian military, has taken a colossal crash in the country that most matters, which is Russia. And it remains the case that I have consistently noticed that in Russian commentaries and in readouts of Russian conversations with Turkish and Iranian officials and other officials, the Russians seem to be avoiding mentioning the name of President Assad. And as for Putin himself, I've noticed that he has avoided any discussion of Syria in his private public comments. He gave a lengthy speech at an important investment forum yesterday, which I will touch on in a moment. And I noticed that he said absolutely nothing about the situation in Syria there, even though he did speak to at least one Arab journalist. And the call, the telephone call between Putin and Assad, which many expected, after all, Putin has spoken to Erdogan and he's spoken to Pezeshkian, but the conversation between Putin and Assad, well, it may have happened, but if so, the Kremlin has not publicized the fact or provided a readout. And again, the Syrians must see this as placing a question mark over Russian long-term support for Assad himself. From a Russian point of view, as of this moment in time, they must feel that he has failed. They probably still retain, as I discussed in my program yesterday, a certain respect for him personally and for his family. They will certainly not want anything to happen to him personally. They will probably do everything they can within reason to try and prop him up. But once that is over, assuming it is even successful, this time I think they will insist on much more far-reaching concessions from Assad if he is to continue to receive Russian support. Anyway, the situation in Syria remains very fluid, very dynamic. As of this time, I'm not sure, as I said, that the Syrian government is going to be able to hold together. It is starting to look increasingly like the situation in Iraq after the ISIS offensive, which led to the capture of Mosul. And it's also starting to look a little bit like what happened in Afghanistan after the United States pulled out in 2021. An army trained and built up over many years, simply melting away and failing to put up any significant resistance. Well, we shall see what happens. We'll see whether the Syrian army is able to pull itself together in some form, whether President Assad is able to find loyal and effective commanders, whether Syrian military units will retain their coherence, whether they'll be able to win, in other words, enough time to enable the reinforcements to come, and what happens then. But certainly the Russians are not pleased, and if you track their media and understand how to read it, you can see that. Anyway, let me now turn to that other great conflict, the one that has dominated media activity for the last 3 years, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And there's been much more news over the last 24 hours from the battlefronts, and without exception, it makes extremely grim news for Ukraine. Firstly, there's been a succession of reports about the state of the fighting from the Russian news agency TASS. Most of it is based on interviews with our old friends, Vladimir Rogov, who is based in Zaporozhye region, the part of Zaporozhye region that the Russians control. And the other is from our old friend, Andrei Marochko, who provides information about the situation in Donbass. Anyway, let's start with Rogov. And he told TASS that Russian troops have liberated an area of over 10 square kilometers to the south of the Suhiyali rural community and entered the southern part of the settlement. Our troops have advanced 2 kilometers deep into the Konstantinopolskaya area and entered the eastern part of the settlement. Active combat continues. Russian troops have liberated roughly 3 square kilometers in that specific area. Essentially, the operation involves clearing a pocket of land south of Kurakovo. Now, all that sounds very banal, but what it actually means is that resistance by the Ukrainian forces south of Kurakovo has effectively collapsed. The Russians have reached the Suhiyali River. They appear to be storming the two key villages of Suhiyali and Constantinople. Once those two villages are captured, and nobody doubts that they will be captured, then a large Ukrainian force, nobody knows how large, perhaps its numbers around 1,500 men. That seems a figure that I've heard, and it seems a reasonable one. A large Ukrainian force located in the east, fighting in various villages south of Kurakovo, is effectively trapped. So that's one piece of news from the Ukrainian battlefronts that TASS has provided us. Now, they provided us with further news. This also comes from Vladimir Rogov. He says that after Russian forces gained control of the settlement of Stary Terny, our troops started advancing towards Kurakovo to encircle it from the west. Hostilities are ongoing in the south of Kurakovo, with our forces also gradually approaching its western parts. And then he went on to say that the enemy's defense north of Kurakovo has been broken, and the Kurakovo-Zaporozhye road has been cut off. And that, again, tells us that the Ukrainian troops in Kurakovo are essentially surrounded. I think that in their case, there are still escape routes. They might still be able to withdraw westwards, but it's going to become very, very difficult for them, given the Russian capture, which notice that Rogov confirms the capture of the village of Stary Terny at the western end of the Kurakovo reservoir. Now, there's been some very agonized comments about what happened in Stary Terny from the Ukrainian side of the internet. Apparently this village, as well as the village immediately to the north of Stary Terny, which is Sonsivka, have been heavily fortified by the Ukrainians over the last few weeks, and significant forces were deployed in these two villages, and apparently it was assumed that the Ukrainians would be able to defend themselves in these two villages for several weeks, and that though it was always acknowledged that sooner or later the Russians would capture both of these villages, it was expected that the Russians would suffer heavy losses doing so. In fact, there have been claims that the Ukrainians thought that the Russians might lose the equivalent of an entire brigade in order to capture Stary Terny. Well, that of course is absurd. But anyway, the Ukrainians did expect that the Russians would have difficulties capturing Stary Terny. Well, it seems Stary Terny fell over the course of a single day. Resistance was brittle, and almost immediately broke down, and Russian losses in the capture of Stary Terny were very low, numbering no more than a couple of dozen men, of whom most, of course, would have been wounded. And it looks as if the Russians are now gradually pushing south from Stary Terny. Their next objective is the village of Dachnie, which lies immediately to the west of Kurachovo. If the Russians are able to capture that village, Dachnie, then I think one can definitely say that the Ukrainian troops in Kurachovo are in a trap. So a collapse of the previously very intense Ukrainian resistance in the Kurachovo area. Then the Russians have more to say about other things that are taking place in other places. So we've had reports now about the situation in Toretsk, and these come from an anonymous official. This is a security official talking to TASS anonymously. We don't know who he is, but according to this official, and this is, I'm quoting now from the TASS dispatch, one of the most important Ukrainian strongholds in Toretsk has fallen to the Russians. And he says that the position that he says the Russians have captured is located in the central mine, right at the heart of Toretsk. This is a mine complex with at least 3 slag heaps. The various mapping projects claim that the Russians control at least 2 of these slag heaps and that only one is still being fought over. And anyway, this security official told TASS, assault operations are now underway at the mine. Enemy troops have been pushed out of their positions, but they're still trying to fight using drones. A mop-up operation is underway. And I suspect that is the 3rd slag heap that he's talking about. And if you follow the logic of this, then it looks like this particular slag heap is going to pass under Russian control over the next day or so. And I should say that once that happens, I understand there's one small area of high-rise buildings, apartment buildings, still left in Toretsk that the Ukrainians would still control, but the Russians would hold all the main positions. They are already, as far as I can see, in control of around 70% of the Toretsk metropolitan conurbation area. The Ukrainians have once again been pushed back to the northern outskirts of this town. Once the Russians have captured the slag heap, the remaining slag heap, perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow, once the Russians have captured this remaining high-rise area, which, as I said, is relatively small, then basically the Battle of Toretsk will have ended, and this appears to be confirmed by the Ukrainians themselves this time. It looks as if a couple of weeks ago, the Ukrainians who looked like they were about to lose Toretsk carried out a series of counterattacks which temporarily pushed the Russians back. As has so often happened in this war, those Ukrainian gains were ephemeral. The Russians came back with renewed force, and they've driven the Ukrainians back. The Russians have recaptured all the positions that the Ukrainians had recovered, and now they've captured more positions beyond them. And as I said, the Battle of Toretsk looks like it's now definitely coming to an end. And lastly, finishing this roundup of reports from TASS, the same Russian security official, who I believe, by the way, is Marochko, just saying. Anyway, he's now given information about the fighting in Chasiv Yar. He says that a large group of enemy troops have been eliminated on the northern eastern outskirts of the plant area. A mop-up operation is underway, and enemy troops are defecting in large numbers in this section of the front line. And the plant area in question is the refractory plant, the biggest industrial building in Chasiv Yar. And this report and other reports that I've seen suggest that the Russians are very close to capturing this factory, which many believe is the linchpin of Ukrainian defense, Ukraine's remaining defenses in Chasiv Yar. Redovka, the Russian newspaper, by the way, either yesterday or the day before, gave a detailed account of the fighting in Chasiv Yar. It said that as the Russians pushed further into the central areas of Chasiv Yar and advanced on the outlying suburbs of Chasiv Yar in the south, the Ukrainians were forced to redeploy forces from the northern suburbs of Chasiv Yar to try to hold the Russians back. That simply enabled the Russians to accelerate their advance in the northern part of Chasiv Yar. The result is that a large belt of territory immediately to the north of Chasiv Yar, including various hills, fell under Russian control, and that the Russians were able to capture various built-up areas in the north of Chasiv Yar, and that this has in turn weakened the overall Ukrainian position in this town. And lastly, to complete this roundup, there are reports that in the key village, key town of Velikaya Novosilka in southwest Donbass, the Russians yesterday captured an important village immediately to the south of Velikaya Novosilka, which is a village called Blagodatnoye. There are lots of villages by that name in Donbass, by the way, but this one is located immediately to the south of Velikaya Novosilka. The Russians have also captured various positions that the Ukrainians held to the south of Velikaya Novosilka. It looks as if Ukrainian positions in Velikaya Novosilka are becoming weaker. The Ukrainians, perhaps in order to raise morale, claimed yesterday that they had recaptured the village of Novi Komar, located immediately to the north of Velikaya Novosilka. The proof they provided, however, was a film which purported to show a Ukrainian soldier with a flag in Novi Komar. The trouble is, the video doesn't appear to show that at all, or if it does, it basically shows a soldier holding a flag. You don't see the whole soldier, but you see the flag over some big prominent hole, which doesn't really mean very much. And it could have been filmed anywhere, as a lot of people are saying. And, well, maybe the Ukrainians have recaptured Novi Komar, but everybody assumes that this is only another temporary recapture of control. The Russians will almost certainly recapture Novi Komar within the next few days. And there's even some suggestions that the real purpose of the Ukrainians in capturing Novi Komar is anyway to evacuate their troops in Velikaya Novosilka in the only direction where a retreat is now possible, which is northwards. And closer to Pokrovsk, an important village, small town perhaps, called Shevchenko, to the southwest of Pokrovsk, is now practically encircled by the Russians. It's widely expected that once it falls, which it will, the Russians will be in a strong position to attack Pokrovsk itself. Well, I haven't given a detailed account of the fighting in Ukraine for some time, but we can see how difficult for the Ukrainians the whole situation on the battlefronts has now become. And the situation, in terms of Ukrainian losses, is becoming worse all the time, and the same applies to the ability to keep the Ukrainians supplied with equipment. Now, a number of very interesting things have been happening over the last couple of weeks. Firstly, all reference to the F-16s, which were supposedly delivered to Ukraine a few weeks ago, all reference to those F-16s has completely disappeared. I remember that the Russians at one point claimed that they destroyed several F-16s, and I wonder whether perhaps they actually did. But whatever, there were claims that the Ukrainians had received F-16s, that there were some pilots able to fly them. One F-16 did get into the air and immediately crashed, the crash being explained by pilot error. And for the moment at least, a curtain of silence has been pulled down over the whole topic. Then, a couple of weeks ago, about 2.5 weeks ago, we got the news that President Biden had reversed US policy, and on citing the fact that there were supposedly North Korean troops in Kursk region. These are the same North Korean troops that the Ukrainian soldiers fighting in Kursk region say they have never come across, and doubt that they are actually there. Just saying. Anyway, President Biden reversed the policy and agreed that deep strikes using ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles should take place against Russia after all, though it was said that they would be confined to the Kursk region itself and to the area immediately around it. And then there were 3 strikes with ATACMS missiles. According to the Russians, these achieved little. And there was 1 strike using Storm Shadows, which according to the Russians, according to Putin himself in fact, apparently achieved a little more. And then we have had nothing. The last strike with Western missiles on a position in Russia took place some 10 days ago. There was reports, I think they were even in the Wall Street Journal, that the United States was considering some kind of strike using ATACMS or Storm Shadow missiles on an airbase, a Russian airbase near Rostov, in Rostov region inside Russia. But that has not materialized. And I noticed that this entire topic of the missiles seems to have also disappeared. A curtain of silence has been pulled down across the Western media about that as well. Certainly, one no longer sees reports about these missiles being any sort of game changer in the war, just as one never reads reports claiming that the F-16s will be a game changer in the war either. So what's happened? Well, the first thing to say is that the Russians retaliated by launching the Oreshnik missile against the Yuzhmash factory in Dnipro. And here I would say that we have now had another massive discussion of the Oreshnik, by Professor Theodore Postol on Daniel Davis' deep dive. And I listened to it extremely carefully. And I would regard this report of Professor Postol's as both authoritative and definitive. The previous discussions that Professor Postol had about the Oreshnik were authoritative because he is an absolute leading expert in this field, somebody that understands this technology extremely well in a way that I do not, but not definitive, because as Professor Postol himself was at pains to say, he was working with very limited data, which he had only a short period to work through and understand, and the result was that his opinions were very provisional. Now he has come back and he's had an awful lot more data and more time to assess it, and I think that we can now take his various conclusions, we can approach his conclusions with much greater degree of confidence. I mean, Professor Postol accepts that he might be wrong, but I'm going to take his views this time as I said, definitive. I would be very surprised myself if it turns out that his assessments of the Oreshnik are wrong in any fundamental degree. Now, the first thing to say is that Professor Postol now believes that in fact, is absolutely confident that the Oreshnik is not a hypersonic glide vehicle, that it is a ballistic missile operating as a ballistic missile. So it's not a hypersonic glide vehicle. I presume that means that the film and photograph that purported to show the Oreshnik flying over the landscape like a kind of comet, pictures which were seen by some people, including Professor Postol, as lending weight to the theory that it was a hypersonic glide vehicle. I think it's probably the case that those pictures were indeed fakes. Now, Professor Postol believes that this is a single-stage rocket, a single-stage missile with an advanced warhead, which contains 6 clusters with 3 warheads each, which also contain various submunitions. And if I understood him correctly, he believes that there were around 66 submunitions launched against the Yuzhmash factory in total. I might have got that number wrong, and if so, I apologize to Professor Postol. But anyway, that's what he thinks. And by the way, it is almost certainly a land-mobile missile. If it is a single-stage missile, we are probably talking about a missile of which the production should not be particularly complex for the Russians, who are very, very well versed in producing missiles. And I am going to revert to the earlier theory that what we are probably looking at is an adaptation of the Rubezh missile. The Rubezh missile was a 2-stage rocket, supposedly with intercontinental or just below intercontinental range. It was going to be nuclear powered. The Russians decided to terminate development back in 2011 because with the development of hypersonic glide vehicles, it had lost its purpose. And I suspect that since then, they've taken the technology that they developed for the Rubezh, one of the stages of the Rubezh, and have developed it into this completely new weapon, which is the Oreshnik, which has been developed to launch conventional warheads. Now, Professor Postel says that the warheads that were used against the Yuzhmash factory were almost certainly solid warheads. They were operating at hypersonic speeds. They will have collided with the factory building, the Yuzhmash factory building, at speeds of around Mach 10 times the speed of sound. In other words, absolutely hypersonic speeds. Though Professor Postel thinks that they would do a certain amount of damage, certainly, but not enough damage to completely destroy the factory or anything close. And they would not have the ability to penetrate deep into the soil or into concrete buildings or to do damage in that kind of way. In fact, he gave a very interesting discussion explaining how beyond a certain point, extreme speed actually reduces penetration. You need to reduce the speed slightly. A missile like the Kinjal, which approaches the Earth at supersonic speeds as opposed to hypersonic speeds, has better penetration capabilities than the warheads of the Oreshnik. And that perhaps lends some weight to the theory that the Yuzhmash factory has suffered only limited damage. Professor Postel did provide pictures of buildings which supposedly are associated to the Yuzhmash factory. But I have to say, I myself, I'm not sure that that is even the case with these buildings. And I didn't really think that the pictures of the buildings provided anywhere near enough information to provide any clear view. Anyway, that then brings us back to the question of whether these warheads can be adapted to carry explosives. Professor Postel thought that perhaps they could, but that it would be an extremely complicated thing to do because of the speed and temperatures, the speed that they're moving and the temperatures that would lead to. And that, of course, then brings us back to the question of whether these warheads could be equipped with its new Hextol metal explosive, which most certainly does exist. I followed up and investigated it after getting information about it from my source. I found that it most certainly does exist and that it does seem to have very interesting properties and that it was indeed developed in Germany and Switzerland, apparently as long ago as the 1980s, but obviously as to its exact properties and whether the Oreshnik has been equipped with it, about that I'm not so sure. But anyway, the Oreshnik, nonetheless, despite the fact that maybe it's not quite as devastating a weapon as some of the initial claims made out, it remains an enormously powerful weapon. It cannot be intercepted. It is certainly capable of doing significant damage, perhaps terminal damage, to all kinds of facilities, including airfields. There is a fine article by the blogger known as Aurélien, which you can find, Aurélien, that you can find on Substack, in which he discusses the way in which the Oreshnik has shifted the balance, the overall military and air balance in Europe decisively in Russia's favor. And I would say that if the Oreshnik really does use established Russian ballistic missile technologies, then absolutely, it is a weapon that the Russians can produce in quantities. We're likely before long to see several hundred of them in operation. It looks like a massive and massively powerful supplement to the well-known Iskander missile system, which the Russians have used very effectively in Ukraine to devastating effect. I've discussed all this partly because I think it's interesting to discuss the Oreshnik, and anyway, I want to correct some of the misunderstandings about the Oreshnik that appeared in my previous programs. But anyway, suffice to say that directly after the Oreshnik strike on the Yuzhmash factory, a conversation between two very important people took place, and these two people were General Brown, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States, and the other was General Valery Gerasimov, who is the Chief of Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. There was a telephone call. It is apparently only the second time that Gerasimov has spoken to his opposite number in the United States since the start of the special military operation. Previously, he spoke to General Milley. This time, he's spoken to General Brown. And the Russians have never mentioned this call. It has never been spoken about in any publication in Russia. The Russian Defense Ministry has never mentioned it. But the New York Times is reporting it. There have, as of this time, been no Russian denials that this conversation did take place, and I am going to assume that it did. So the New York Times tells us that it was the Russians who initiated the call, which this time is logical, and I am going to suggest that the purpose of the call was to warn the Americans, to tell them, look, you are now crossing our red lines. We've demonstrated that we have this capability with the Oreshnik. We've destroyed 5 of your ATACMS launchers. We are coming after your people in Ukraine. You know all this. If you go on launching missiles against us, the gloves will come off, and we will come after you, and we will come after you hard. And we have demonstrated that we have the capability. Certainly we can use the Oreshnik to go after your missile positions in Poland, the Aegis offshore system. The Oreshnik would certainly be able to do massive damage to that particular system. And of course, if it uses Hextol explosive, and if Hextol is indeed all that it's cracked up to be, then of course the damage would be potentially enormous. And anyway, if this continues, we are prepared to escalate, and to escalate decisively back. And, well, there have been no American or British missile strikes on positions in Russia since that call. I'm going to suggest that the combination of the Oreshnik strike, the destruction of the 5 ATACMS launchers, the hunting by the Russians of the American and Western personnel in Ukraine, all of this has caused a pause. There is at least some discussion, some alarm in the United States, especially that the situation is indeed getting out of control, and that Gerasimov's warning, because that is what it must have been all about, has probably had an effect also. So that's probably why we've heard nothing more about missile strikes against Russia for about 10 days now, and why we see so little of the F-16s, assuming, of course, that they still exist. I'm going to say this. I think that the whole attempt by the Biden administration to try to bolster Ukraine, to keep the Ukraine war going before Donald Trump's inauguration, to rush supplies and technology and all of that to Ukraine, to get the missile strikes going against the Russians, to get the F-16s operate. All of that has now run into the sand. The Russians have demonstrated that they have this enormous capability with the Oreshnik. The Russians have destroyed the HIMARS launchers. The Russians have given their warnings, and the warnings this time have been given by the chief of the general staff in Russia, no less. He's taken the unusual step of involving himself in diplomatic activity, just to say. And I think that in the West, in the United States, they've run out of options. They don't know very much more what to do. Now, yesterday, I spent some time at the start of my program discussing the situation in South Korea. I said that a possible explanation for what had happened, one, by the way, which I noticed a lot of people agreed with, is that this bizarre coup that was attempted in South Korea yesterday was intended to remove the parliament and the opposition parties from contention in order to enable South Korea to start supplying Ukraine with arms, something that the South Korean president seems to be willing to do, but something which the opposition in parliament strongly opposes, and which is strongly opposed by wider South Korean society. Now, if that was part of the plan, and I suspect it probably was, the idea that you give Ukraine lots of money, billions of dollars in loans, the Ukrainians that buy weapons in South Korea, which they can't any longer receive from the United States because the arsenals there are run down, and Trump anyway doesn't want to send any more weapons, and nor does the Pentagon, incidentally. That plan has now miscarried. The plan to scare the Russians with missile strikes or to provoke them into some kind of nuclear retaliation which would destroy the prospects for discussions between Moscow and Washington after Trump became president. That basically collapsed following the Oreshnik strike and the Russian strikes on and the Russian destruction of the ATACMS launchers. And there is real uncertainty now about what to do. We had a very strange meeting of NATO. The Ukrainians came along and insisted that if they were going to make any territorial concessions to the Russians, even on a temporary basis, they would only do that on the condition that they were granted, in effect, immediate admission into NATO. The NATO countries would not agree with that. Even the Biden administration apparently contemplated that possibility a few weeks ago, but then realized that there would be too much opposition in Europe. So they decided that they wouldn't proceed with that idea. So there was no decision to admit Ukraine into NATO. And despite the promises of more weapons, none of these promises have so far converted into anything specifically real. When I went on Daniel Davis' deep dive a couple of days ago, Lieutenant Colonel Davis showed me film, an interview with Zelensky, in which Zelensky bitterly complained that he needed equipment for 10 brigades, but that the West only provided him with enough weapons to equip 2.5. Now, nothing Zelensky says should be taken as real, but the point is that the Ukrainians are not getting the military equipment on anything like the scale that they were previously, or that they would probably need in order to continue the war for very much longer. So, having said a couple of days ago, Zelensky having said in a number of occasions that, well, yes, he might be prepared to let the Russians occupy some territory for a short time in order to get a ceasefire, provided Ukraine got NATO membership, though he did expect that eventually all that territory, including Crimea, would be returned to Russia. Well, the new Ukrainian foreign minister, according to Bloomberg, has now reverted back to the original Ukrainian default position. He's going around making statements that, in fact, Ukraine isn't prepared to make any territorial concessions to the Russians whatsoever, not even on a temporary basis. And I can't help but think that the reason the Ukrainians have hardened their positions again is perhaps because there's been some pushback from the ultra-nationalist forces in Ukraine. That certainly cannot be excluded, but because the Ukrainians now understand that they're not going to get NATO membership, despite the fact that they're seeking it, and that this trade-off, NATO grants them membership in turn for them agreeing to territorial concessions, that's simply not on the table. And as for all of those plans about sending troops, peacekeepers into Ukraine, all of that, well, Western leaders have talked about it, European leaders have talked about it. Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, of course supported it, but all Western leaders say that this is something that must be done as part of a peace settlement. These are supposed to be peacekeepers in some ways, though, as I've said already, 100,000 men, which is the number that people are talking about, is not a peacekeeping force. It's an army intended to fight another army, specifically the Russian army. But anyway, put that aside. I get the sense that enthusiasm for that idea is dimming as well, as it's becoming increasingly clear that the Russians will never agree to it. So there's been an awful lot of manoeuvring, an awful lot of attempts to shift the situation, to crank up the war, to do so before Trump becomes president, to provoke the Russians into some dangerous overreaction, to get the South Koreans perhaps to pour weapons into Ukraine, to get commitments from European states to send troops to Ukraine. But it's all got bogged down in the sand. None of it is real. None of it is practical. These were all dangerous or fantastic schemes. The Russians have demonstrated their ability to respond to the missile strikes, and the Pentagon has noticed. The idea, if it existed, of pouring in weapons from South Korea into Ukraine has presumably collapsed with the coup in that country. I should say that in South Korea, the president continues to cling on to office. He's refusing to step down. The defense minister and the army commanders who participated in the coup have done so. The opposition is trying to impeach him. The president's party says for the moment that they're going to stand by him and are going to oppose the impeachment, though I wonder whether that will be a possible position, an achievable position, if an impeachment does indeed get underway. But anyway, if there was a plan to send weapons from South Korea, as I said, the collapse of the coup has probably put paid to it. And so there's nothing very much left. What they're doing instead is one of the most heartless, cynical, ruthless things that has happened in this war up to now, which is this constant demand, now repeated publicly by US Secretary of State Tony Blinken, that Ukraine lower the conscription age to 18 so that boys fresh from school are rounded up and thrown into the meat grinder, which is the front lines in Ukraine. Now, I've expressed my feelings about this demand in many places. I don't want to go over it again. I'm going to say that it's the most heartless, the most cynical, the most ruthless demand that I have seen made at any point in this war. Countries like Britain, the United States, France, Germany, NATO, all of these countries that say that they're helping Ukraine, defend itself, are now telling Ukraine that it must prolong the war, a war which is clearly lost, by sacrificing the lives of its teenage children. I mean, I just find this so shocking. I'm at a loss for words to express my views about this. These are the people who claim to support Ukraine, and they want a whole generation of young Ukrainian men, some of them teenagers, sent to the battle to be destroyed by the Russians. They won't have enough weapons. They won't have enough supplies. The F-16s have failed. The missiles apparently have failed. The artillery shells have not been provided in sufficient number. The Russian army is becoming more powerful. And yet all of these politicians in the West, none of them have any skin in the game. They're not fighting on the front lines. Their children are not fighting in the front lines. They and all of these commentators in the West, about whom one can say the same, they are demanding that Ukraine, this country that they say they want to help, they're demanding that Ukraine sacrifice the lives of its young people. And there is no pushback. There is no articles or opinion pieces or editorials in the media in the West pointing out how outrageous and cynical and ruthless and horrible this demand actually is. So ultimately, though, coming back to cold-blooded analysis, more cold-blooded than I feel about this, coming back to cold-blooded analysis, this is all apparently that's left. You can provide Ukraine with some prohibited landmines, prohibited by Ukraine, by the way. The United States, like Russia, has never signed the relevant convention, but Ukraine has. So you can supply Ukraine with anti-personnel landmines, which Ukraine itself prohibits. At least the convention Ukraine has signed prohibits it. You can demand that Ukraine enlist its children, but in all other respects, to all intents and purposes, you are out of options. Well, there it is. Now, let's get back to General Kellogg and Donald Trump, because in a few weeks' time, this doleful situation will be thrust upon them. They will be the people who will have to deal with it. They will be the people who will have to try and find a way through this dreadful situation that Ukraine, and it must be said the West also, find themselves in. And this is where I think that it is important that the new administration takes a tough-minded and realistic view of the present situation. Ukraine has received vast amounts of Western weapons. This endlessly recycled and regurgitated narrative that the Biden administration has held back on supplies of weapons to Ukraine is simply not true. The Biden administration has done everything that it can to help Ukraine and more. The same is true of the countries, of the other countries of the NATO alliance. They have stripped themselves of many of their Leopard 2 tanks. They said huge proportion of their self-propelled guns. They provided Ukraine with HIMARS systems, large numbers of HIMARS missiles. They've provided Ukraine with radars, with drone technology, with satellite technology. They've done a huge amount to support Ukraine. The problem is exactly as Barack Obama said way back in 2016 in that interview he did in The Atlantic, no possible provision of weapons to Ukraine can ever offset the inherent superiority that the Russians have in this region. The Russians have escalatory dominance in Ukraine and will always do so. Now, and we have seen this clearly demonstrated over the last few weeks with the Oreshnik strike, the destruction of the ATACMS launchers, and these continued Russian advances that I discussed earlier in the program. Now, there's been talk about intensifying sanctions, and there's a narrative, a dangerous narrative that's circulating again, that because the ruble went through a apparently temporary periods of softness, which for the moment at least seems to have abated, and because inflation in Russia is rather higher than the central bank and the government would like, and because interest rates in Russia have been pushed up, with the central bank talking about pushing them up still further to bring inflation back under control. Anyway, there is a continued narrative, a dangerous narrative, that Russia is almost exhausted, that its economy is in a terrible state, that it cannot really sustain the war, that the war economy, the Russian war economy, is dangerously overheating. And all we have to do is wait a little and increase the sanctions pressure just a little, few notches more. And finally and eventually, we will achieve the outcome that we are seeking. Well, as it happens, Putin recently attended a investment forum in Moscow, where he talked about the current state of the Russian economy. He seemed to be in a buoyant mood, by the way. He made a number of very interesting observations about the Russian economy. He spoke about dynamic growth, expansion of manufacturing, rapid expansion of manufacturing, rapid expansion of investment. He seemed to feel that the inflation situation was a temporary one and would be brought quickly under control. I agree with him, by the way. I think that next year we will indeed start to see inflation fall with interest rates as high as they currently are. It is inevitable. But he also said a number of things which I found very interesting, and which people who have this narrative about Russia imploding perhaps needs to keep in mind. Firstly, as the Russian finance ministry has confirmed, for the moment at least, for the first 9 months of the year, Russia ran a budget surplus. Now that may not last, but certainly the Russians, for the moment, give every impression of keeping their financing under control. More interesting was what Putin said about the proportion of government spending as a proportion of the country's GDP. He said that government spending in Russia accounts for 35% of GDP. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are going to dispute that figure, but if it's true, then it is far below what we see in most European countries. I believe it is even true of the United States as well. And bear in mind that government spending in Russia obviously includes spending on the war, but it includes spending on lots of other things too: education, healthcare, infrastructure spending, all kinds of other things. But the overall picture very much is of a financial situation, a fiscal situation that is well under control. No sign of exhaustion there. And he also spoke about the investment situation, and that investment in Russia is rising. That, by the way, is the single most important reason why we're seeing inflation increase, just to say. Investment is rising. He said that, he very interestingly said, that the effect of the increase in interest rates has been that consumer lending, consumer borrowing, has basically ended. Russian consumers are not borrowing anymore, at least not on anything like the scale that they were doing earlier in the year. Probably, by the way, in the run-up to the New Year holiday, borrowing has increased again, but just to say. But anyway, New Year borrowing by consumers has fallen, but borrowing by corporates, by companies in Russia, has been barely affected. He said that this is exactly what the government and the central bank have been working to do. In other words, they're trying to bring inflation back under control by reducing consumer spending. But despite the fact that the investment surge is arguably the single biggest cause for the higher inflation, they want investment to continue at a high rate because they feel, the central bank, the government, Putin, they feel that higher investment will eventually lead to higher output. Higher output will satisfy demands for goods on the Russian domestic market, and that is the most effective long-term way to bring inflation down. Now, Putin may be right about that, wrong about that. He may be over-optimistic about the dynamics of this process. But again, the key point to take away from this is that there is no sign of exhaustion in the Russian economy. There is no sign of exhaustion on the part of the Russian army in the battlefields either. The Russians continue to have huge reserves. They can rotate troops. They can continue to advance. They can absorb losses. And the West consistently overstates or overestimates Russian losses. About that, I have no doubt. And their offensive, therefore, is not going to slacken. Now, there was an interesting article, which again I got from Jeff Roberts, the historian. He always is very adept at circulating articles. Anyway, there was an interesting article in Unheard by Aris Rousinos. And the article is, will Putin escalate in Ukraine? Western fears have shaped the conflict. That is a very misleading title for this article, which doesn't remotely do it justice, because it is not about escalation. It is about negotiations. And the point that Aris Rousinos is making is that the West has left it too late to consider the negotiating path. The Ukrainians are clearly losing the war. There is no way that this can be turned round. Given that this is so, the Russians have little incentive to compromise in any substantive way. Just to quote, it is surely optimistic to assume that following years of grueling and costly warfare, Russia's terms now will be amenable for Kiev, as amenable for Kiev as those which Ukrainian negotiators once toasted with champagne. He means the Istanbul agreement. While Russian officials suggest the 2022 negotiations may be a workable starting point for talks, the war's dynamics have slowly shifted against Ukraine so starkly that Putin may hold out for a more decisive conclusion. And he then acknowledges that there's a real possibility that the Ukrainian front lines could collapse soon, at some point over the next few months. And he warns that trying to keep the war going, exactly as Lavrov recently warned, is not going to put Ukraine or the West in a better negotiating position. It's going to put them in a weaker one. And this pattern is only likely to continue. Indeed, he floats the possibility, very unusual from a Western commentator, that we may be so far past the point of no return that the Russians might cold-bloodedly decide that as far as they're concerned, there really is nothing to be gained by negotiations at all. They might just as well continue and crush and defeat the Ukrainians so that they can then dictate whatever terms they choose. I think that might be going too far. I think the Russians might decide that they are prepared to come to some terms, if only to try to get some kind of agreement about the general security position in Europe in order to ease tensions between themselves and the West so that they can focus more of their energies on internal development and things like that. But he makes a strong and valid point This is an article which I think the Trump people should read and might want to think about. I say this because I've been listening to the things that General Kellogg and others have had to say in the United States, and though I do get the sense that Kellogg at least is a little bit more pragmatic than some of the Biden people, I think there is still a belief that the United States has stronger cards going forward in terms of ending this war than it actually does. Of course, there are still the outright nihilists, people like Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, who doesn't want Ukraine to begin any sort of negotiations at all. He wants the war to continue until Ukraine is in a position where it can, in a stronger position than it is in today, which is, of course, a recipe for Ukraine's total defeat and complete collapse. But let's put those people to one side. If there is a genuine intention to obtain peace in Ukraine, to end the war, to free the United States of the burden of this war, to rescue the Ukrainian people from the catastrophe that they face, and to restore some semblance of peace to Europe, then an acknowledgement that the Russians hold all the cards, all the strong cards, is essential. And a negotiating strategy has to be built around this. Well, that's my program for today. We're seeing with interest what happens in Syria, and of course the negotiation position in Ukraine will no doubt continue to evolve over the next few weeks. There is always still, unfortunately, a possibility that the Biden people still have a few tricks up their sleeve, and we mustn't discount that either. But anyway, that is the position as I see it today. There'll be more from me tomorrow. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day. More from me soon.